Thank you, Jason. I would like to thank Center for Cross-Cultural Studies, and many thanks to Alex for bringing me here and giving the opportunity, and I'm really excited. So I hope the screen is visible. Is the screen visible?
Yes, I can see. I have.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll just give an overview of the research paper, right, which entitles like Understanding Deleuzoguattarian Lines of Life through the Indian Concept of Saṃskāra. So at the outset, Saṃskāra, the impressions that Indian schools of thought have dwelled into, and I'm going to compare them. So I've divided my paper into a few parts, where the first part is life as a difference. And in this, we have this process of absolute through manifestation and actualization, returning to absolute with difference, which Deleuze talks about. And he also gives this term of circle of eternal return. And the orange thing is the parallels which I have drawn from primarily Sankhya system of philosophy, right? And from this absolute, I'm trying to dwell a bit more on it. And the second part of my paper talks about this. Sorry. Yeah. Which is univocal being, Brahm or Purusha in Sankhya system, which is also a plane of transcendence. And it works in tandem with the plane of immanence, where the variation occurs and the process of actualization happens. So the third part of the paper will talk about how the life process, what happens in this life process using Deleuzoguattarian lines, molecular, and lines of flight. And this is a processual. It has a parallel in Indian system with molecular is itcha or desire. Even Deleuze talks about the desire coming from jnana or knowledge, which is akin to sanskaras I'm talking about, which are impressions, as I've already told. And these sanskaras, they travel the double path. One is the movement from one to many, where which can be explained with the guna theory again from Sankhya system, which is the movement from absolute one, that is virtual, to many singularity or singularities as per in person or action. And the other path that sanskaras travel is back from many to one. That can be understood as liberation, moksha, salvation, and we have other terms in Buddhism and all, right? So the fourth part, there's a change. The fourth part of my paper talks about sanskaras. And the fifth part, if the time permits, I will be talking about, if I've told what is the life process here, I'll be explaining how. Using three syntheses, connection, conjunction, and disjunction and conjunction from Deleuze and Guattari, and we have parallels that how this process happens with the Ved, that is momentum, bhavna, that is imagination, and sthitistapak, that is elasticity, that what happens in the action, right? Which is actually a reaction. So this is what I will be dwelling on. So I start reading my paper now. Though I've timed my paper, but I would be happy if I am just told when the time is to wrap up, right? Thank you. So unthoughtful liberation set as a norm was actually a bait to the capitalist world of profit-making industries. Even from delusion point of view, the freedom as a result of evolution has a limited position. It underplays the role of change and novelty and overplays the role of freedom in relation to reason and to action. This is not to deny freedom or advances of science, but to be wary of the metaphysical and evaluative presuppositions they carry with them when attempting to work with the great momentum inherited from the past in relation to the future. So I think there was a question in the morning about the lives of the past. I hope it's answered now. The progress at the breakneck speed slowed down with the pandemic global situation. Freedom is thus inherently retroactive. not simply a free act that starts a new causal link, but rather a retroactive act of endorsing link of necessities which determine the subject. So the subject is a fold of reflexivity by means which I retroactively determine the causes allowed to determine me. Deleuze claims that once the subject emerges, then, I quote, on the basis of qualitative impression in the imagination, memory reconstitutes the particular cases as distinct. So this is a filtration we were talking about, conserving them in its own temporal space. The past is then no longer the immediate past of retention, but the reflexive past of representation of reflexive and reproduced particularity. Unquote. This is from Difference in Repetition. The excess of the effect over its causes means that the effect is retroactively the cause of its causes. The state of consciousness is epiphenomenal from the causal standpoint, and it has its own causality. The subject is simply the organization of impressions themselves. It is thus constituted by a synthesis rather than being the agent of synthesis. Levinas acknowledges this when he says there is a beyond of this totalized being. He says a surplus always exterior to the totality. Even Deleuze endorses when he says, oh, the poverty of the symbolic and imaginary, the real always being put off until tomorrow. So the first part I begin with where life is a difference. Delusion theory moves from the illusory transcendence to the inclusive immanence, which is not a relational difference, but a continuous positive difference, unlike the structural differences which emanate from the undifferentiated origin. Deleuze is in partial agreement with structuralism. He acknowledges the differences, but not as an imposed material system of signifiers, but his difference is singular as every essence of difference is its imperceptibility. This theory is modeled on life, which itself is difference, and this difference is in each case different, continuous, and becoming. In the logic of sense Deleuze develops, there are two modes of genesis of reality. Now, this genesis of reality, this reality, I'm taking Purusha. Purusha is from the Sankhya system. We can understand him as an objective unconsciousness. From there is an emergence of reality out of immanence of impersonal consciousness. I'll just share the diagram which can make the things more clear. Here. So we have Purusha, which is consciousness, right? And there, from there, we have emergence of reality out of immanence. This is from primordial matter as the pure flow of becoming. I was talking about the two possible modes of genesis of reality. So this is the first mode, that is formal genesis, that is Prakriti, supplemented by the emergence of the material out of bodily interaction. Immaterial out of bodily interaction, which would come here, tanmatras. These will form impressions, right? This can be understood with the guna theory. Now, guna theory is combination to form for the sake of actualization. So this can be understood with the guna theory of the Sankhya system, where the primordial matter or prakriti enters into different combinations among gunas to constitute or characterize any singularity. Now, the former is the absolute one in Deleuze and Purusha in Sankhya school, and the latter can be understood as territorialization. This whole process is territorialization, or the process in which trigunas permutate and combine. Now, what Peter Young was talking about in the morning when he was understanding, brain and mind. Now, this is how in Sankhya system this is the whole part of brain as a physiological and psychological divisions that happens in, and mind is a part of it. So I won't go deeper into it because of the limitation of the topic. Now, I was talking about the univocal being in my first part, and I was talking about that how the process occurs. Now, I am continuing with that. Now, I'm talking about this is evident. What is evident? The univocal being is evident from the verse 13 of the chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, which is one evidence among many that are present in that scripture, that book, right? I am reciting from there. Gama Vishyacha Bhutani Dharyameha Mojasa Pushpami, that's a Sanskrit. Pushpami Chaushadhi Sarvaha Somo Bhutva Rasatmak. So this is a verse that tells you about that univocal being, which is nourishing all. It is that all permeating energy that nourishes all the living beings. It's the juice, essence of life, right? Deleuze also explains this as, I quote, the whole is not a closed set, but on the contrary, that by virtue of which the set is never absolutely closed, never completely sheltered, that which keeps it open somewhere as if by the finest thread which attaches it to the rest of the universe. The whole creates itself and constantly creates itself in another dimension without parts, like that which carries along the set of one qualitative state to another, like the pure ceaseless becoming which passes through these states. Paradoxically, the biological insight of all the living systems is leading towards homeostasis, which can be understood as salvation, liberation, samadhi, moksha, whatever, right? Now I move on to the second part, which talks about university of being, Purusha, Brahm, multiplicities, and difference. And I think I can afford a shot here. I'll read some portions. The emergence of pandemic conditions worldwide can be inversely understood as the disappearance of matter in void. Interestingly, Deleuze also views multiplicities as incorporeal effects of corporeal causes. Deleuze's notion of the virtual is a radical one in that its ultimate reference is pure becoming without being, and not the metaphysical notion of pure being without becoming. Pure becoming suspends sequentiality and directionality. The immanent force of becoming is liberatory in nature and even cannot simply be identified with the virtual field of becoming that generates being, but it is causality. This delusion difference has infinite deviations as the atoms. Now, the smallest units that make up life, they are not things, but events of difference. This is a very technical thing, but I would not go into detail because here it is the Vaisheshika, which is another school of Indian system, talks about atomic theory of life, and I've written a separate paper on it. But I'll just mention one thing which might be important here is that how Vaisheshika is a school, emphasizes on the inductive side of reasoning with its realism and pluralism, as it explains that every element has two parts, nitya or permanent and anitya or transient. So the permanent part is nitya. Nitya means something which is absolute, and it has a counterpart which is anitya, which comes on the surface, which is actualized, but it is transient. It is of transient nature. So the permanent thing can be seen as an ocean of potentials, and it is limitless, whereas the transient one is the territorialized, limited self. The plane of transcendence is a univocal plane from which difference emerges. Deleuze's plane of immanence is eternally at variance, which cannot be given any substantive description in terms of being, and is also different in each of its expressions, each being unique. The university is not the dualist ground, but the immanent where no point of difference can be privileged over another. Univocal being is at one and the same time it is nomadic distribution and crowned anarchy. This is again from Deleuze. So univocal being I've compared to Purusha, where again Bhagavad Gita comes to support, where I have noted down two verses, 24 and 29 from the 7th chapter. So the 24th is Avyaktam. Let me not recite, right? But it gives you about the univocal being, which is changeless and supreme. But because of our reductive, limited personality, we are not able to understand that higher nature. This is what the verse says. And the second verse says about that how if the living beings who are striving for liberation, They have to realize in full the Brahm, that is univocal being, and will have to have the whole knowledge of the self and all action, right? Thus, in Gita, the absolute or the ultimate objective consciousness is the transcendence which forms the basis of immanence. It is understood normally as that which is Niragun Nirakar. Again, Niragun is immaterial, and Nirakar is formless, which is body without organs. So something which is Brahm, it is immortal, imperishable, never ending. And this has God. This is something which is interesting, that it has God with organs as a part, which is delusion superfold, or it is also known as Ishwar in Vedantic school. So this is the ground. This is the ground. It forms the ground of the formless Brahm, the immortal and perishable of eternal dharma, and it is unending divine bliss. This is not different from Deleuze when he writes about lightning, and I quote, "Lightning which distinguishes itself from the black sky must also trail it behind, as though it were distinguishing itself from that which does not distinguish itself from it. It is as if the ground rose to the surface without ceasing to be the ground." And moving on to the third part, which tells you about the life processes and how we can have a parallel of Deleuze and Indian concepts. So this paper is an attempt to look into these comparative concepts and to study the event of pandemic. The research attempts to explain the continuous life processes in terms of Deleuze's three lifelines, their points of synthesis, processes of deterritorialization, territorialization, and reterritorialization, and also rhizomatic existence. The processual concepts of Gyan, Ichcha, Kriya. Gyan translated to be knowledge or Samskaras. Ichcha is desire, and which is process, and it leads to Kriya, as I've told, which is action. Samskara are the impressions I'm reiterating. Karmic theory is the theory of causation. They can be studied as parallels. This phenomena or event is a study, a query into new life, physical, psychical, corporeal, and mental, and at both the individual and collective level. Now, I would like to draw attention to this, that this is a karmic theory or theory of causation, which involves not only individuals' karma or actions, but collective level. In his dialogues with Claire Parnett, Deleuze asserts that, I quote, "Whether we are individuals or groups, we are made of lines," unquote. In 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze calls these break or segmental lines or molar lines, crack or molecular lines, and the rupture or lines of flight. These three lines have soul or absolute or Brahm at the backdrop. Deleuzian answer to the explanation of soul bridges the disciplines of theology and philosophy. The West with the Orient fuses that were thought to be disoriented and even diametrically opposite. Let us have a look at a tripartite system of lines and see how these can be interpreted as per Indian thought system. The break lines or molar lines are the living systems of this empirical world, which are territorialized and hence they're visible. These are the outcome of the other two. Next, we have crack lines or molecular lines, which are relativization of the third or rupture lines, which are lines of the flight. Now, these rupture lines are Denozian chaotic lines that can be seen as the potentialities that surface into Apollonian molar lines, which are binaries and social codes driven. Interestingly, which very well fit into the schemata are crack lines, which can vary from individual to collective, where societies and groups are involved. In reverse, this is a process of disindividuation or disindividuated becoming, right? So I think I can skip this. You must have already had a look at this page number 6 of PDF. So it tells about the parallels that can be drawn. And after the process of actualization, again, we are left with here impressions. So I will be talking about now these impressions, that is samskaras, more to get a clear picture of what they are and how they're involved, right? What we are the samskaras we have imbibed or aligned ourselves to. They exist in the virtualized poles of micro variations and results in the human self through decisive now this is filtration, decisive fold which forms a line of action. The movement is from physical to non-physical in understanding or realizing the self. The absolute is not somewhere out of us, but the source of creation which perplexes us all the time is within us. One who aims at it becomes aware of the immense potentialities in the virtual world that give rise to the physical identities. Samskara can be understood in the context of Indian culture and civilization in relation with one's socio-religious duties, but is more pertinent to understand the unconscious tendencies of her psyche, past, present, and future. Etymologically, the word sanskar signifies to make or assemble together into a perfect whole, where some is more with nasal sound, together, and kra is from kriya, action, to do. The three lines of life, molecular, molar, rupture, they are the three concepts on which life happens. That is vasana, again, another word drawn from Indian philosophy for desire. This desire happens from residual impressions, kashaya, or passion, and finally karma. Whereas the procreative process, now this is again, I find very interesting. Whereas the procreative process or the passage from one to multiple or the scattered multiple is indicated by shram. This is shram, that you are making an effort, right? The shram, that is effortlessness or dissolution, is a sort of dissolution. The ritual effort of bringing together the multiple towards one is expressed through sanskar, reuniting the scattered parts into one homogeneous whole, something again weaving together and some to put together. Thus, Samskara in the Indian philosophy covers both conscious and unconscious tendencies of our psyche at both personal and collective level. They're present since the Rig Veda, which is one of the four sacred, canonical, and the oldest known Vedic Sanskrit text, and throughout the history of Brahminical literature, they underline their integral part in the human life. I would like to, okay. These sanskaras are the rites produced as scriptures, I think. And in this, I just want to bring out that an Indian system of transmigration, now sanskaras are very important whereas transmigration is concerned, because an Indian system of transmigration, it is not metamorphosis, but metempsychosis, that is mind is also switched over, that gets transformed along the body. And this again, explains Deleuze's circle of eternal return. He says, eternal return is neither qualitative nor extensive, but intensive, purely intensive. Now, an individual who is seeking the center, he is actually at the circumference of the circle, right? And the center is always calm. It is from Len, I've read Lenin in Anti-Oedipus, where the center of the circle is always calm. It's the 0 degree of intensity against the absolute, right? So I'm going to combine sort of sanskara and the life processes. The life processes begins with rupture, scattering, dispersal of death. The pandemic is a symbolic of inherent evil, different from the idea of original sin, and it hails new life of the new order. This is a visible endorsement of the very fact that things have had a beginning in time. This is, in order to eliminate the figures of prevalent evils under the umbrella of blind development, we have paap. Paap is Hindi word, Sanskrit word for malady. Nivritti is evil and disorder, that is anartha. This pandemic institutes the hope for harmonious world order, Rita. Rita is a Sanskrit, again, word for righteousness. The procreative process that results the passage of one to scattered multiple is the line of crack, which is the relativized molecular giving birth to visible molar. And the molar multiple world efforts back towards one through corporal, vocal, or mental rituals of penance or tapas. Now, this is again, penance and tapas. And I would say that what we are, dealing with in pandemic is penance. Penance is tapas and adha, and then you have tyaga. Tyaga is a sort of sacrifice. This reuniting the scattered parts into one homogeneous whole can be understood in the etymology of the word sanskara. Now move on to the fifth part, which is the last part, and I'm going to deal with the with the processes of synthesis, conjunction, connection, disjunction, and conjunction. And I think I'm very well in time. So Lakshmi Kampani tries to explain Samskara through three applications, very similar to the three divisions we came across earlier. Vega is momentum. Bhavana is the force of imagination, which brings past into present for reproduction and representation. And then there is Sthiti-Sthapak, or elasticity. It can also be understood as elasticity. They come under gunas or characteristics. It's just trying to reach the page if I can. While. Sorry about that. In all its three aspects, Vega, I told momentum, Bhavana is feeling, sense, and Sthiti-Sthapak, it is the persistency of the effect after the cessation of the initial cause. There is a perfect liaison between past and present, or between conscious and unconscious phases of her psyche. The wake or motion is both tangible and intangible organs of mind. The mind links outer worlds through sense organs, also known as indriyas in Indian philosophy, in Sanskrit that is, to the inner soul, which transmigrates, carrying impressions or samskaras along. This is a quality or attribute or guna. Thus, vague or momentum is one of the three modes of process of potentialization. In a bow arrow example, it is the voluntary movement initiated, but the residual energy develops a movement in the arrow. Elasticity is the form of samskaras with a restorative tendency. That means every action we think is an action is actually a reaction. We don't know about it. Again, it's autopoiesis sort of thing. The movement among the three lines occurs due to assemblage formed between samskaras. The impressions also, when they happen or they contract inside, actually that is outside time, where they're active, and they are quantified representations when outside, and they're prone to judgment. So now we're going to talk about the three syntheses. Now, how does one draw from a differential unconscious, which is the creative basis of the being? This happens when there is an active synthesis of the multiplicities that run through it by willingness to bring into existence which does not exist. Deleuze himself inadvertently draws this to similar Indian spirituality when he says, I quote him, because the modern world is tumult and chaos, the task of the modern man is to get out of the tumult and chaos. How? Building up a spiritual life of one's own. It's the contrary of the modern dialectic of the Hegelian. Building up a spiritual life of one's own, that is to say, a spiritual life which does not owe anything to what is existing, but you have to bring it into being. It is your task to bring into being something that you will not take from what exists. This affirmation of the difference is open, non-hierarchical, welcoming the becoming axial stance between the lines. Interestingly, the application of bringing into existence that does not exist is perpetual, endless effort. In the Indian thought system, also attaining moksha, salvation, or liberation is perpetually sought after. In the end, if we are willing to express a discursive singularity, it brings us back to what we are. So a little joys as Deleuze expresses, which is very close to Ananda or bliss in Indian philosophy. A very interesting quote from Deleuze, one of the lectures of Deleuze. He says, we are little joys, but no longer know it. Feel that these are the words of salvation for philosophy. This is the philosopher's creed, and this does not mean I'm happy. What stupidities have been said about Leibniz's optimism, this does not mean anything is fine. When somebody tells you, like Plotinus, be joyous, this does not mean, come on, folks, everything is fine. Be joyful. Contemplate and fill yourselves up. Fulfill yourselves with what you contemplate. The impressions are thus, they form a vital principle of becoming, and these are impressions of reflecting the origin of spirit. It is through imagination, which is singularization of impressions, that expands from space the original spatium of difference. The power of imagination is to imagine in power. That's what Deleuze says in empiricism and subjectivity. The experience of, Thus, human life is accounted for by the fact that it is formed by the tension between the void and the desire for novelty. But this is no new dualism. It occurs when pluralism is equal to monism. This is very important to understand, that there is no beginning or end, no void at the start or maximal intensity in the end, but always a middle point through which life grows and overflows. The play of lines, rhizome is not formed according to the principle of reproduction, but of creation. Singularity is the creative intensity. The subject of pure life is immanent in experience. It cannot be made an object of experience. Again, that was something which was discussed in the morning, that it can be intuited as a subject, but not as an object. So all life is a desire, a flow of positive difference and becoming, which is intensive to difference, which is extensive, otherwise a negative. Now, there is one immanent plane of life, or as desire, that's a creative striving of life in general, including all the perceptions and sensible encounters of all bodies. It's the act of body itself. The plane is one ever differentiating and productive plane of desire, from which emerges the distinct terms for organization of desire, or the coding of flows into distinct organisms or events. So desire is in the form of the revolutionary. It's a revolutionary in nature, alien to structure, organizations, and extended systems. Paradoxically, it breaks down the plane. So this is again a slide that shows that how we can draw parallels, where plane of eminence through desire is the first synthesis that leads to territorialization. The first synthesis refuses to locate desire within persons or agents of intention, but this is desire as desire itself, and when syntheses or connects and produces organisms. This is different from traditional evolutionary theory, as here each connection is the becoming of a flow of life, but it is not an isolated becoming. It becomes only through connection with another becoming.
Meenu,
I'm about to finish. Yeah, thank you.
Conclude, maybe.
Yeah. I'm about to finish. Thank you.
Okay.
The flow of life, virtual origin of all these specific intensive flows as a whole of interconnecting and interrupting intensive flows emerging from difference. So I've already talked about, you can have a look that this can be understood as thinking, vasana, leading to feeling, that is sense, to willing, which is an action, which will lead to action. So an empirical self is actually amalgamation, or it is cognitive, affective, etc. So this, and I'll just conclude my paper. Just talk about 2 or 3 things here. So alongside the thing which I wanted to bring out is, along the synthesized world, that is Cosmos, the intense germinal flux, there is also this body without organ or mechanosphere. Now further, the system which is actualized, it is also reacting on the intensive, it is cancelling, it is repressing, it is prohibiting them. And this is the karmic circle, which comes into, it gets expanded, it gets created through via the process of manifestation. Now, what I've talked about Prakriti, or the primordial matter, now this is very akin to what Deleuze is talking about egg, which actually provides a milieu. So I will not quote him, but this is his egg, which provides that milieu for creative genesis, right? So last part, through the creative genesis, there is becoming or actualization, where a virtual tendency can be manifested in different ways. Interestingly, this is neither an organism's response to the outer world, nor owned by organism. The organism is just a vehicle or a passage through which becoming flows. The history of thought, or samskaras, ground synthesis on some subject which gets interpreted as the activity of some being. Desire is the formation or production of difference, all the while bearing in mind the difference is different in each of the becomings. Thus, we conclude that these are not conscious or active synthesis, as they are not acts of mind or decisions. The syntheses of life, the difference in repetitions from which organisms emerge, are productive and infinitely richer than the closed forms we seem to perceive. So I'll end on a quote from Clear Book. Being evolves not by unfolding what it is, but by selecting and actualizing a multiplicity of its virtual powers to become. Thus, becoming is not the action of an object world. Becoming is desire and synthesis. Further, the relations and connections or syntheses of life are secondary to the formations of the singular powers from which distinct beings emerge. Thank you.